I have an admission to make. I've been a runner for 48 years, and today I became a CrossFitter for the first time. So, you know, if I can't lift my arms up, you'll understand. So it was really interesting to see the culture of your community, and it was quite really exciting to see it. And I compliment you on what you're doing and what Greg has done for the world, or in the last 10 or 15 years. It's a movement that has such potential that I hope that we will be able to grow it and extend it. And my wish would also be that some of the science would be able to come from you, that your own experiences could be in some way measured and interpreted as real evidence for the benefits of what Greg said, that we want physical activity and the right nutrition. And I just hope that we can do that. So I'm going to talk today about a talk which I've evolved over the years, and it's about my own experiences. And what you'll find that I'm taking Coles to Newcastle, because a lot of the examples I use are of brilliant American athletic performances. And you may not know it because you live in America, but those of us who don't live in America, we see you as a nation of believers. You believe in yourselves. And that's not something that I, as a British person born in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, of British parents, the belief in self is not something that is widely cultivated. And I'm going to show you examples of how I came to understand the importance of belief in yourself in athletic performance. And I absolutely believe, and I'm going to show you an example, one of the best that I was involved in, and which is really astonishing. It was an achievement that's never been matched, in which belief determined the outcome. And I believe that when you go into an activity, unless you believe in the outcome, it's not going to happen the way you want it to happen. So I begin with a trip. I went to the North Pole with my great friend Lewis Pugh. And those of you who read the New York Times this morning will see Lewis is in the paper again. Lewis wanted to show that there is global warming and that you can swim at the North Pole in summer. So that was his goal, and it took him about 4 years working with myself to get to that point where we believed it was safe enough for him to swim there. And when I can just get this, there we go. So our goal was that he was going to swim 1 kilometer at the North Pole in a Speedo and goggles. And my job was that he should return alive. Now, you may think that that's simple, but at the North Pole, the water is 4 kilometers deep, and it is minus 1.6 degrees centigrade. So if we made an error, he was going to be at the bottom of the ocean, and I was going to be back in Cape Town. And if you think I'd had problems defending this nutrition story, defending that would have been a little bit more difficult. So he came to me in about 2003, and he said, "Can I swim around the Cape Peninsula, which is where we live, and I'll show you what it is." And everyone had said, "No, you can't do it," because they didn't understand the biology. And I'm a biologist, and I answer questions from the biology. So I said, "I know it is possible. The biology it's possible to do it. It's not impossible." So he set out to swim. So he started at this point. Cape Town is on a peninsula, and so he swam around the Cape Peninsula in 13 days, and those are the distances he swam. And it wasn't particularly cold. But there was a moment out here because there's very big surf and very, very big sharks, and he got a bit scared. and he was thinking of quitting, and he said, "No, there's one person who believes in me." And he carried on. So then he decided he wanted to go and swim in all the oceans around the world, and some of them are very cold. And he hadn't swum yet in the Arctic Ocean. So he said, "Okay, we're going to go next to the Arctic Ocean." He said, "What's the expected water temperature?" He said, 0 to 5 degrees. I said, "I can't guarantee that you'll live." Because there were no data. No one had swum under those conditions and had reported that they'd survived, and we had some data on them. So we put some experiments together, which I won't show you, it'll take a bit long. And we proved that it was possible for him to swim down to 3 degrees centigrade, plus 3, for about 20 minutes. So we said, "Lewis, you got 20 minutes, boy. That's the time we're allowing you in the water. After 20 minutes, we're going to be a bit of a problem." So we then went up to this island, Spitsbergen, which is a Norwegian island heading towards the North Pole. And he did 2 swims there, and then he did a swim down at the south, 2 swims in the south on the Antarctic Peninsula. And then 2 days later, we went We went slightly further north, and he swam for a mile, 1.6 kilometers. And here he is swimming. The water temperature was 2 to 3 degrees, a bit warmer. Here we're monitoring him with my student. Here, he and me both fat. We're both eating the high carbohydrate diet at that point. And afterwards, I decided that being a scientist, I want to know what his muscle temperature is. And so I put a needle into his muscle, a thermometer, and it measured 31 degrees, which normal is 37, of course. His core temperature was 34.5. And he was conscious, but not fully conscious. And, and then we put him in the hot shower, and his temperature dropped to about 32.5 or 33. And eventually, after about 20 or 30 minutes, his temperature started to rise again, and we knew we were safe. But his muscle temperature stayed 31 degrees for an hour in a hot shower. He was literally a block of ice when we took him out the water. And that's how humans survive. We maintain our core temperature, keeps our heart going, and that. So here was some of the data we had. Let's just start that again. So he had this incredible ability. He could raise his temperature 1 degree centigrade by looking at the water and knowing he was going to have to dive in. And that 1 degree was added 5 or 6 minutes onto his swimming time. So it was hugely important. And you'll see that when he exited water, his temperature was still quite good, and then it drops, so you've got the post-exercise drop. And so that it looks pretty safe. You see, he's only dropped to 1 degree or so, and so that's fine. And the same happened, I think this was in Antarctic, the 1 kilometer swim that you saw. But then he went and swam some 1.6 kilometers, and the really interesting thing was that at 1.5 kilometers, something changed. And I was looking at him, and I knew something has changed. I'm like, don't tell me what it was, I don't know. But I had the feeling. And what had happened subsequently, because his temperature started to drop. And it was within 100 meters, his temperature was dropping quite dramatically. And then he got out the water, and you can see it went down to 33, and then it rose again. This is his core temperature. And I picked that up, because what we look for is how well he's swimming. And when he gets cold, he can't extend his arms. And then he starts to swim like this. But it was more than that, because there was something else going on. Anyway, he was getting really cold. So we learned from that there's a critical time that you can swim. And in his case, it's 30 minutes at this temperature. He swam last week at the Arctic. He wasn't right at the North Pole. He was just at the edge of the ice. And he swam for 22 minutes. He's not quite as fast now as he was 10 years ago. And that was epic. 22 minutes in that water is something else. So we know that it was safe for him to swim for, say, 25 minutes. But beyond that, he would be in trouble. That's a great, I think he's 45 now. He was about 33, 34 then. Yeah. So then we went to the North Pole. And the way you get to the North Pole is you go to Murmansk in Russia. Here we go, Murmansk. And then you take the boat straight out there. It takes 7 days to get to the North Pole, which is quite a long time. And then you come back again. And of course, this is just ice. So these guys are so skilled, the Russian pilots, that they've parked it in the ice. And the ice is moving. And it's moving incredibly fast, because in the 18 minutes that he swam, the start where he was swimming had moved 200 meters. We could check that on our Garmins. So that's how. So if you ever go to the North Pole and you want to get there, you must go from this side, because then the ice is moving with you. If you go this way and try to walk to the North Pole from this side, every time you sleep overnight, you go back 6 kilometers. So this was his swim at the North Pole, and what we did was we had 250 meters of water that was open, and we put a flag every 25 meters. And it was really interesting, because I didn't, when you're up there, it's cold and isolated, and you're worried about the polar bears. And I had a GPS, so I could measure the distance, and then I'd reach here and I'd put the flag in, and I'd look at the GPS, and it was still moving. And I couldn't understand it. GPS is moving. How can it be moving? So, of course, the whole ice was moving, but I was too anxious to realize it. And this was, I think, the most frightening thing I've ever done in my life, was to watch this guy swim in -1 degree water for 18 minutes. So anyway, eventually did it, and the success of the project was based on we had absolute trust in each other's ability. I became his coach. He called me coach afterwards, and he still refers to me as coach. It was never a doctor-patient relationship. It was a relationship between a coach and an athlete. I was also very privileged to work with the South African national rugby team, and who won the World Cup, which is kind of like the Super Bowl for rugby. So of all the nations, once every 4 years, they play a competition, and the team that wins, obviously, is the world champions. And my role was to get these guys, these 30 guys, on the field for the final. And that was the job I had to work with, because South African rugby doesn't understand rest. They just know train, train, train. And we had to introduce new ideas of resting, and we completely radicalized the way that we rested these players, and we broke every rule. And they won the competition on the day that they competed, because when the coach came to me, I said, 4 years earlier, I said, to win this competition, you have to have 30 players available. You have to have your 22 best players, because the team is of 22. Not 21 of your best players. You have to have 22 players ready to play on that day. We had 30 players ready to play on that day. And I learned a lot from this guy who was the coach. And he wrote this book, and this is what he wrote when he was a 17-year-old. What are my dreams for the future? My greatest dream is to play rugby, especially for the South African national team, the Springboks. But even to become their coach, I've seen how you can make people believe in themselves, how you can show people that every single person can be a winner if you want it. And he wrote this as a 17-year-old, and I asked him, I said, Jake, how did you learn that? He said it was simple. I played rugby for my high school, and every so often, the coach would come along on a Monday morning. We played a match on a Saturday. On a Monday morning, he'd pick out a player and he'd say, you know, you really played well on Saturday. I really think you could become a player of stature. And he would name the teams that the guy might play for. And he said from that moment, that player would now play as if he was on that team. But Jake said the problem was the coach never said that to me. So I knew I had to be the coach, not the player. But when he first met the team, on the very first day that he met the team, they had just won the World Cup for the under-21 team. And he said, you've just won the under-21 Rugby World Cup. You will win the 2007 Rugby World Cup. And that was on the first day he met them. And he never varied from that belief, and he stuck with it. And the players at this time said, that's impossible. We don't beat New Zealand. We don't beat Australia frequently enough to expect to win. But he said, but you've just beaten them. That 4 years' time, you're going to be playing the same guys. Why can't you beat them? And it took a lot of time for him to get that message across. I was fortunate to speak to the team just before they left for the World Cup, and they were just about to get on the plane. And I said, I want to speak to you tonight about the most important lesson I've learned in 38 years of studying the human body. For you would think that after studying the body for so long, I would say that it's your perfectly trained bodies that will win the Rugby World Cup for you. I used to think that, but I do not anymore. What I now believe is this: what you really believe will happen is exactly what will happen. And these athletes bought into that. And by that night, they were saying, we've got to start believing, etc. And they won the competition comfortably. They won all their matches in the tournament. And then this was one of the key moments, because South Africa don't like the English. Not many people like the English. I'm English, so I can tell you that. So if you ever go to Britain and you see Scotland playing on England, everyone's on the Scottish side, no one outside England. So this was a key moment. And this is a penalty where the guy kicks a long kick. And this guy's 19 years old. He's the youngest player ever to play in the World Cup final. So he's a young South African, and he's got the responsibility of kicking this ball something like 60 meters. And what's interesting is to hear the English commentator, what he's saying. Because you can imagine he doesn't want this ball to go over, because the score is going to go out to 7, what's it now? It's 9-point difference. And in rugby, that's quite a big difference. We play 80 minutes, there's only 19 minutes left. So everyone knew that if he gets this kick over, then it's going to be really important.
Well, you can tell what the crowd think of that. Young Francois Steyn yet to get on the scorecard here.
So it's a huge kick. It's one of those really long kicks. And he's 19 years old.
And this one, again, has tremendous length. But the question has to be asked, has young Steyn got the accuracy for the 3 points that South Africa wants?
And the answer was, and look, the kick went way over. And the point about that is, if you don't see it going through the poles, it's never going to do it. We teach our kickers, as you do in your country, that you don't think about the kick, it's gone through the poles, that's it. And you don't think. So part of the key in sport is that you mustn't think in the key moments. And I don't know if you're watching, we've got this chap, Wade van Niekerk, who won the 400 meters and beat Michael Johnson's record recently in the Olympic Games. And if you watch the Olympic Games, you watch him run the 400 meters, as he comes across the finish line, he looks up like this. And it's like he doesn't know where he is. I mean, you don't do that when you finish a race. And the commentator went up to him and says, Wade, how was the race? What did you think about it? He said, I don't even remember the race. I don't even remember the race. And that's being in the zone, which I'm sure you all know about. And why did he set the world record? Because the second 100 meters, he ran in 9.8 seconds. Now, no one will do that if you were coached. You wouldn't run that. There's no one going to run 9.8 for the second 100 meters. And that's where he set the world record and won the race. So in the end, the players achieved what the coach said they would on the first day he coached them. And of course, it could be coincidence, but the point was that's, in my belief, is what you have to do. So I work at the University of Cape Town, and I've worked with this team for a long time. And the analogy I drew was that ours is not a sports university. And I checked at University of Wisconsin. I see you ranked the 18th best team of history. In history, if you look at the rankings of the universities, University of Wisconsin is about 18, which is about what we would probably be in a ranking of South Africa. And in this competition, we had to play Notre Dame, USC, all the big teams, Alabama, etc. And we'd never played them. And we were on a hiding to nothing over the years. And we built a team that won the championship and then won it under very unusual circumstances. And this was the team that won this match, and they won by 39 points to 33 points. But the point was they scored 18 points in the last, 24 points, in the last 5 minutes of the game, which has never happened before in the history of the game. And I'm going to show you how they did it and why they did it and how we prepared them for it, how we prepared them to believe that they could do it. So it's been called the greatest comeback win in the history of rugby. And in fact, we've described the little book. We wrote a little book about it. But so what happened was in 2007, this new competition was announced. And these are the Alabamas and the USCs and the Notre Dames. And we just don't beat them. It's impossible. And the coach came to see me. And he said, Prof, I've got this huge problem. We're ranked 8th in this competition. And these guys could beat us by 50 points, which is, you can imagine, is a complete whipping. And he said, what do we do? So he said to me, Prof, we ranked 8th out of 8, and the tournament could be eliminated after the first year. How do we help that team that could be beaten by 40 points a game? And I said, we have to teach them to believe in themselves and in miracles. That was all I could say. So that's all we had. And when I spoke to the team, I said, you have to believe you're going to win this competition, because that's all we have. And you have to train appropriately as if you've already won the competition, and you've got to start now. So in November, we started. And at the end of the season, we were the top team. We only lost one game, but then we went to the semifinals, we won. We lost the final in the last minute of the game. So we turned around a team that shouldn't really have done this well. And the quality of the players in these other teams was just much, much better than our team. But yet we managed to do that. And then 3 years later, we won the championship. And then I'm not going to tell you about that match. I'm going to tell you about the one where we won in the last few minutes. And this is what we worked on with this team. Those were the key values that we tried to instill in the team. And where did I get it from? I got it from American football. I mean, it's not that I'm teaching you something that's not common in America. But remarkably, it's not common in the rest of the world. I've got a great friend who captained the Australian rugby team. And I showed him this talk, and he said, no one tells us about those things. And the Australians are one of the great rugby nations in the world. So these are the rewards in proportion to the effort and importance of perfection. And that's what I learned from Americans. And I certainly learned it from American football. American football is about perfection. It's not excellence. Excellence isn't good enough because someone else is going to be perfect and you're not going to make it. And that's a concept that is difficult for many people. Self-belief, character. I mean, all the American coaches say we choose for character, we select for character. The importance of the team, importance of not quitting, and understanding the why. And I'm going to focus on a couple of these, not all of them, but some of them, with examples, because Because these are the principles of life as well. They're the principles of life. And if you want to be successful, you must incorporate them, not just to be a great athlete, but to be a great person. So anyway, here's this game. Now, a rugby game lasts 80 minutes, and you can see that we are losing seriously. We've scored 15 points in 75 minutes. We're 18 points down, and we've only got 5 minutes to make up those 18 points. And so that was the background, and I'm going to give you the background later as we come along. So I'm going to start talking about the importance of self-belief and where I learned about that in specific examples that I've of my career. So let's start with, this is one of my favorite cuts, is from Friday Night Lights, which many of you may have seen the documentary. It's one of the best books you can ever see. They say to understand Americans, you have to understand Friday night football in high schools. And so Friday Night Lights is just a most wonderful, wonderful book. I must say that that's another thing we say in South Africa, that if you want to really read good literature on sport, it's American literature. For some reason, you put the warts and all, it goes in, but the rest of the world doesn't quite get it quite so good. So this is the guy, this is the first game of the season, and he's speaking to his team, and this is what he's going to tell them about belief in an indirect way. So
we've been thinking about this for 4 months now. Now, you seniors have been thinking about it for 17 years. Well, it's here now. It's time. If any of you have any doubt in your mind, I don't want you to walk through that door over there. You shouldn't have any doubt in your mind about what you're supposed to do tonight and about how you're supposed to do it. So let's take care of it!
And you know, I mean, this may be silly, but one of the strengths of the American schooling system is the coach and how strong they are and how powerful an image they give. I was fortunate to live in America and go to high school for 1 year on an exchange program. And I learned how important the coach was to the culture of the school. And not every country has that. We don't have that. You're very fortunate to have those coaches, quality people like that. So, okay, now let's get back to the self-belief issues. If you were around in the 1950s, there were 2 guys trying to break the 4-minute mile, and an American. There were 3 guys. But these 2 did the most, and the reason the American didn't break it, because he was overtrained. He was over-racing because he was in the college system. He was over-racing, wasn't rested, whereas these guys could rest, and that's ultimately why they did it. So Bannister breaks the world record on the 6th of May and breaks a 4-minute mile. And then a few days later, or weeks later, John Landy, the Australian, breaks it again and lowers it substantially by more than a second. And if you look at this, and then they had a fantastic race at the Commonwealth Games in 56, yeah, but this was a famous race. But we won't talk about that race. But if you look at the world record for the mile, you'll see that between 1931 and 1945, it dropped dramatically, and then it gets stuck here for 9 years. And the reason why these guys did so well, because Sweden was neutral, and so they could do lots of training in the war. But they unfortunately they got declared professional, and the Swedes have never forgiven anyone for declaring these 2 guys professional. So anyway, during this time, John Landy, the Australian, ran the mile in 4 minutes and 2 seconds 7 times. 7 times. And this is what he said. Frankly, I think the 4-minute mile is beyond my capabilities. 2 seconds may not sound much, but to me it's like trying to break through a brick wall. Someone may achieve the 4-minute mile the world is wanting so desperately, but I don't think I can. And when you say that, you tell your subconscious that 4 minutes and 2 seconds is what you want to run. And you program the brain to do that. And you really have to understand that. The brain is not stupid. If you tell it to run 4.2, it will run 4.2. And it's very important, the negative concept, and we'll come back to the negative statements, which you're not really allowed. So what happens next is Bannister breaks the world record, and then John Landy, 46 days later, runs 3-4 seconds faster than he's ever run in his life. And that can't be because of physiology has changed. He realized that he had the potential to do it, and he went out and did it. But Bannister, 50 years later, on the 50th anniversary of that record, he tells us what happened on that day. And it turns out it was a typical English midsummer day. It was raining, wet, miserable. The wind was howling. And when Bannister arrived at the racetrack, he arrived 3 hours early. He said to his coach, "Forget it. I'm not doing it. It's awful. I can't break the record." And his coach says something to him a little bit later. And this is what he remembers 50 years later.
The crucial thing that he said was, well, I think you can run a 3:56 mile. If he believed that, I hope he did. It certainly was a helpful comment. And he said, if you have the chance and you don't take it, you may regret it for the rest of your life.
So he says 50 years later, he still doesn't know whether the coach actually believed he could run a 3:56 mile, but of course it didn't matter. What the coach says that you could run a 3:56 if the conditions were ideal, but you can run a 3:59, and that's of course what he went and did. But his coach was really interesting, and his coach said the following: training is principally an act of faith. And, do we teach that at CrossFit? I don't think so. We teach that your biology changes, you get fitter and stronger and so on and so forth. But he said the athlete must believe that through training he'll become fitter and stronger. He must believe that his performance will improve. And that's really interesting. And for years I couldn't understand it. And now I really believe it. That if you don't believe that it's going to make a difference, it probably won't. Or conversely, if you believe it's going to make a difference, it will make more of a difference if you believe that. And then his coach said something else. The greatest hurdle was the mental barrier. And in other words, you first have to jump the mental barrier before you can get yourself physically prepared. And I always say that that's so obvious when I speak to audiences and I say, okay, I can train you to do X. And 70% of the people say, it's not possible, I couldn't do that. That's the first belief they'll have. But 30% will say, it's easy, let's go for it. And that difference is really important, I think. That it really does define the elite athlete from the rest. That the elite athlete says, okay, what's the problem? Let's go and do it. And they don't make the mental barriers that we make. We make up those mental barriers. So Bannister said, I shall always regard the crux of his contribution that on the day of the race, he gave me the self-belief that despite the bad weather, I could break the 4-minute mile. I believed him. And without the belief system of both, it wouldn't have happened. And so the next great athlete was an Australian, and I won't show the video clip, it's Herb Elliott, but he, at the age of 21, has never been beaten in the mile. He sets the world record as an Olympic gold medalist. And this is what he said. To run a world record, you have to have the absolute arrogance to think you can run a mile faster than anyone who's ever lived, and then you have to have the absolute humility to actually do it. And you've got to have this balance, and that's what we see in the really world-class athletes, that they're able to be both arrogant and humble. And the humility comes, of course, from failure, frequent failure, but you have to believe. And it's not wrong to be arrogant, but you have to have the humility, and the balance has to be perfect to be successful. Here's my great hero, is Jim Ryan from Kansas, who, as a 17-year-old boy, on this day in this picture, became the first schoolboy to break the 4-minute mile. And he was an astonishing athlete because at the age of 13, he was just did nothing. And he writes about himself. In a sense, he's quite derogatory about what he does. At 15, he starts running. At 13, he starts running. And then at 15, his coach calls him in and says this to him. Let's talk about goals, his coach said. What do you think you can do a mile in? This year, I said, I don't know, maybe. And then the coach says, not this year. I mean by the time you're a senior, which would be in 2 years' time. I never really given it any thought, maybe 4:10. I said, he has no clue, he just gives out a number. I'm talking about the 4-minute mile, Jim. No high school boy has ever run one. I think you can be the first. I'm convinced you can do it. Coach, I think you're crazy. And then he continues, at the time, I had no idea what a 4-minute mile was. So he couldn't conceptualize and have a belief. I was only 15 years old, basically still a child. he was certain of my ability even if I wasn't myself. And that's the definition of a coach. A coach has more belief in you than you have in yourself. And that's what coaching's about. And that's what you have to generate in your community. He had always tutored several very successful milers and believed in his coaching system. As difficult as it was to make the adjustment to consider yourself a champion, a front runner, as a good athlete, I did my best to trust in the coach's judgment and to believe his words. Though I was initially dumbfounded by his prediction, it did in fact prove not only to be accurate, but to set me on target for what would be the essentials of my life for some time to come. What's really interesting is that Coach Timmins hadn't a clue about coaching. And he went to the swimming coach and he said, so tell me, how do you coach your guys? So he said, well, we do 800-meter reps. And we do all these things. And he did this incredible volume of training, which was no runner had ever done at this age. And so Ryan was able to do this huge amount of training, and that's why he was perhaps ultimately successful. So Timmins said his goals for Ryan were very high, much higher than Ryan thought possible, but I was willing to go along. Ryan wrote later, and he was a spectacular athlete. And then, of course, the greatest athlete of all time. I'm the greatest. I said that even before I knew I was. and you can see the humor in that. You can see that's arrogance, but he always had the humor. The humor was with Ali. So then we come down to the sport that this is the most difficult sport in the world. There's no question in my mind that this is the most demanding activity, not physically, but in totality. It is such a complex sport. And this is Joe Montana said, winners imagine their dreams first. They want it with all their heart and expect it to come true. There's no other way to live. So this guy, as you know, become one of the greatest of all time. But not only has he got the physical, he's got the skills, but he's got this mental approach as well. And anything of those, if he didn't have the belief, he could have all the rest, but it wouldn't come together. And what I'm always interested in is how can you have so many American football coaches, but there are only about 10 who really make it? Or the same with quarterbacks. There are maybe 20 or 30, I don't know, who really make it. Think of all these million, and what makes the difference that those few people make it to the top? Well, he was lucky to meet Bill Walsh, and Joe Montana came to the San Francisco 49ers believing he was extraordinary. My job was to convince him that he was beyond extraordinary. And when I show this to South African audiences, what's this? How can you be beyond extraordinary? But and he was a genius because he, as you know, he changed the game of football. I was fortunate to go to Stanford and give a lecture right in the 80s when Bill Walsh was still alive. And he literally walked in the middle of the lecture and everyone stood up. In the middle, the guy was talking and the whole audience stood up and clapped him because he'd helped Stanford and so on. So he also understood the culture. Walsh knew that if you established a culture higher than that of your opponents, you would win. So rather than obsessing about the results, you focus on the team. And in a sense, that's always a challenge for any organization you're running. You've got to have the culture. The culture has to be better than your opposition. So what I learned at CrossFit this morning is that you're a team, which I didn't know before. So now think about, we've got this final, we're playing the final against a team that beat us very badly in the preliminary games. And I speak to the team quite often, so now I've got to find some new message for them. And I find this book in 2014, The Boys in the Boat. And again, it's an American story. It's from the University of Washington. And it turns out in 1932, these young men all come to the University of Washington, and they have one skill, that they row very well together. And in 1934, the coach says to them, you are going to win the Olympic game gold medal in 1936 in Berlin. They've not won the major championships in the United States. They've not beaten anyone. He says, you are going to win this competition. Now, the reason that we know this story was because the writer was called to the deathbed of one of these guys. And the guy said, did you know I won a gold medal at the Olympics? I've lived in this community and I've never known that. So he says, tell me about it. And so then the author speaks to him, and this is what the author remembers. And it's a brilliantly written book. It's an astonishingly written book. The guy took 5 years to write it, and it's worth every moment.
And I noticed after a while that tears were coming to his eyes. and they were coming at particular points in what he was saying. He began to tear up whenever he began to talk about the other boys who had rowed with him in 1936, the other boys in the boat. And at first I thought he was crying for the loss of them because nearly all of them had passed away by this time. But I began to understand, as he talked more, that the tears weren't so much for the loss of them as for the sheer beauty of what they had done together and what they had become together. There was a sort of transcendent joy behind those tears. And I knew right then and there that there was a great story here. And so I asked Joe that very day if I could write, actually I asked him if I could write his story, and he said, no, you can write a story about all the boys in the boat, and hence the title.
So the writing in the book is just spectacular, and I've just taken 2 sections from it. And this is the one bit, which is something when teams join up and mold together, something happens, and we can't really explain it. Over the years, as the coach saw successive classes of oarsmen come and go, as he watched immensely powerful and proud boys strive to master the vexing subtleties of their sport, as he studied them and worked with them and counseled them and heard them declare their dreams and confess their shortcomings, George Pocock learned much about the hearts and souls of young men. He learned to see hope where a boy thought there was no hope, to see skill where skill was obscured by ego or by anxiety. He observed the fragility of confidence and the redemptive power of trust. He detected the strengths of the gossamer threads, those tiny, fragile threads of affection that sometimes grow between a pair of young men or among a boatload of them striving honestly to do their best. And he came to understand how these almost mystical bonds of trust and affection, if nurtured correctly, might lift a crew above the ordinary sphere, transport it to a place where 9 boys somehow became one thing. A thing that could not quite be defined, a thing that was so in tune with the water and the earth and the sky above, that as they rowed, effort was replaced by ecstasy. It was a rare thing, a sacred thing, a thing devoutly to be hoped for. And I said, that's what you want in sport. You want those moments, because life is ephemeral, it's short, and you're at the peak of sport for a short time. And that's what you want. And if you can think about it and do it, then that's worth doing. So here's a little clip which even shows them rowing in the 1936 Olympics.
In 1936, as the Nazis prepared to stage the Summer Olympics in Germany, 9 working-class boys in the American Northwest nurtured an impossible dream.
They came out of nowhere, out of logging camps, dairy farms, shipyards, and small dusty towns. But in 1936, in an old shell house at the University of Washington, they found one another, and together they set on an epic saga. Ahead of them lay the prospect of Olympic gold. They crushed the 2-time Olympic champions at the University of California. They beat the best crews in the East, the well-heeled sons of bankers and lawyers and corporate titans. They took on rowing's elite aristocratic British boys from Oxford and Cambridge and smashed the world's record to win the right to row for gold. Then, in Berlin, the heart of the new Nazi state, the stage was set. On a nearby balcony, Adolf Hitler stood watching. Out on the water, his German boys wore swastikas on their chests. The crowd, 75,000 strong, began to chant, Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. And the flag was dropped.
So this is the German team, gets the best water on the inside. The Americans, because they're the strongest crew, are given the worst water on the 6th lane. So you don't see too much of the Americans rowing. And the key was that the stroke, who's the key oarsman, was so sick that they decided he was almost not able to compete. And the team was down until the last 200 meters, and you'll see them here. This is the American team. And they win by about 6 inches, having come from about a length down with 400 meters to go. And the book ends with the story of the race. And again, it's just beautiful writing and describing what sport's about and why you do these things. In the last desperate few hundred meters of the race, in the searing pain and bewildering noise of that final furious sprint, there had come a singular moment when Joe realized that with startling clarity that there was nothing more he could do to win the race beyond what he was already doing, except for one thing. He could finally abandon all doubt. Trust absolutely without reservation that he and the boy in front of him and the boys behind him would all do precisely what they needed to do at precisely the instant they needed to do it. He had known in that instant that there could be no hesitation, no shred of indecision. He had had no choice but to throw himself into each stroke as if he were throwing himself off a cliff into a void, with unquestioning faith that the others would be there to save him from catching the whole weight of the shell on his blade. And he had done it over and over 44 times per minute. He had hurled himself blindly into the future, not just believing, but knowing that the other boys would be there for him, all of them, moment by precious moment. In the white-hot emotional furnace of these final meters of Greenough, Joe and the boys had finally forged the prize they had sought all season, the prize Joe had sought nearly all his life. Now he felt whole, he was ready to go home. And it wasn't the gold medal that was important, it was the bonding as a team in that final 100 meters when they'd achieved what they'd wanted to do. And they would live the rest of their lives on that moment. So that's what we told our guys. This is a moment in your life, it's never going to come again, and you have to make the most of it. There's another clip from Friday Night Lights, which also talks about team and the importance of being there for the other person. And this comes from the last section of the movie where the team is in the finals. They're 3 touchdowns down at halftime, and the coach explains to them what he expects of them.
It's real simple. You got 2 more quarters and that's it. Now, most of you have been playing this game for 10 years. And you got 2 more quarters, and after that, most of you will never play this game again as long as you live. Now, you all have known me for a while, and for a long time now, you've been hearing me talk about being perfect. Well, I want you to understand something. To me, being perfect is not about that scoreboard out there. It's not about winning. It's about you and your relationship to yourself and your family and your friends. Being perfect is about being able to look your friends in the eye and know that you didn't let them down because you told them the truth. And that truth is that you did everything that you could. There wasn't one more thing that you could have done. Can you live in that moment as best you can with clear eyes and love in your heart? With joy in your heart. If you can do that, gentlemen, then you're perfect.
I'm always interested in why these races end so closely. How can you come down to, you race for 26 miles and there's 6 inches difference. So in this race, this guy wins by 3 seconds, or about 30 meters, it was probably 4 seconds. And the second runner ran behind him, 30 meters behind, for 4 kilometers. And you think, well, come on, close the gap. It's only 3 seconds. Why can't you do it? And that's a really interesting question, because what you'll say, well, you see, he's got too much lactic acid in his muscles and so on and so forth. So here's the truth is always there in pictures. So here they are 2 seconds or a minute later, and the guy comes second, looks really happy, so does our guy. And then there's another picture, and this is the picture, picture tells 1,000 words now. So let's see what this picture tells us, why this guy came second. So the picture tells us. So here's the guy who wins, and he's not absolutely fatigued. And that's really important to understand, that you have a brain that regulates your performance to make sure you get to the finish without dying. That's what your brain is there for. And so he's not absolutely fatigued, and that's why he can walk around. And for evolutionary reasons, it's very obvious. When we used to hunt animals and we killed them 20 kilometers from where our home, we couldn't just drop dead. We had to go 20 kilometers home, carry the animal back again. So we always had to have this reserve. So this guy is alive. And what does that tell you? He could have run faster. Yeah. Yeah. And so the question is, why didn't he run faster? And if you read the story of Josiah, will tell you that he was doing a typical sprint, and he would sprint ahead, and this guy would catch up, and he'd sprint ahead, and he'd catch up, and eventually sprint ahead, and the guy wouldn't catch up. Because the guy makes a decision. Because running is a battle between the subconscious of these two athletes. And his job is to convince this guy that today it's not worth the extra effort. It's worth coming second. And that's, all sport is like that. It's all like that. The one brain has to convince the other brain that it's game over and it's not worth the effort. And we've got some research which we're publishing very, very shortly to show that if you put two competitors against each other, this instant the one guy goes ahead, the other person's physiology changes. The instant it happens. And they start to think, and the emotion changes, and everything changes. And we found that winners like this, or in the race that they're winning, they keep a very high emotional level. They don't see it as hard work or negative or anything. It's easy for them. It becomes more difficult for this guy, and as we'll come back. So that's got nothing to do with physiology. And we tell our teams in rugby, if you lose by 3 points, you chose to lose. It's too close. The two teams are too matched. It can't be that. So we developed a model called the central governor model. And it tells us that the brain regulates the exercise performance. So the winner, the athlete who chooses who wins a close race, chooses that outcome. This conscious-subconscious choice reduces the illusory symptoms of pain and fatigue produced by the brain. For that, you have to understand that the fatigue you feel during exercise is an emotion. It's got nothing to do with your physical state. And I can't go through the whole model, but that's the truth. And I'm going to show it to you in a second or two. So the brain of the athlete who comes second exaggerates those same symptoms to justify the decision not to try harder. So the athlete quits while appearing to be giving a maximum effort. And when he comes in, he says, I couldn't have done anything more. I'm exhausted. I was so tired, I couldn't try harder. And that's not true. You make the choice to come second. So now the famous race, the most famous endurance race that there's ever been, was between these two Americans. And I'm friendly with both of them, and so I'm not going to side with either of them in this race. So here's Mark Allen. And Mark Allen was an astonishing athlete. For 14 years, he dominated the triathlon. But in this race, 5 times he had failed at this Ironman triathlon. And he was racing against Dave Scott, who'd already won it 6 times. And he decided that he had to do something differently to win the race. So he went down to Mexico, and he lived with the shamans, a religious group, and he did all sorts of things. And of course, then he trained extremely hard as well. But he realized there was something wrong in his head that wasn't working. Dave Scott, of course, would expect to win the race, and so his goal during the race was he was going to wait for the last 2 miles, and then he was going to sprint ahead because he was a better downhill runner than Mark Allen. Just as an aside, it's really interesting because Mark Allen was always eating more fat than Dave. Dave was a very high carbohydrate diet eater, but he wrote to me about a couple of months ago, and he said, Tim, you're right. High fat diet, the only way to go. Yeah. And he said, your recovery is so much better. And he's looking magnificent in his 60s. And so anyway, this is the race. And they now they've got 16 kilometers to go in the run. They've swum together 3.8 kilometers. They swam next to each other. They cycled 10 meters apart for 180 kilometers. And they've run together for 30 kilometers, 26 kilometers. For 8 hours, they've not spoken to each other. And they've been close. So now they talk about the race and what happened. And the theme here is what happens when you quit.
I realized he's not backing off. This is not a surge. This is the pace that this guy is going to hold for the second half of this marathon. And then my mind went absolutely crazy. You know, those, he's too strong, he's going to win it again. My energy's starting to go. I started to feel weak. I thought, all the visualization I'd done, everything I thought was perfect, and it's not working once again.
I felt as though, as each mile went by, that the pace was fast. I knew it was fast. And I said, there's going to be a break point. Mark is going to probably hang on a little bit longer, but just keep going at this pace, and I'll really know when that point is going to come. I'll sense, because he's right next to me, that he's breathing harder, that he falls back a little bit more.
Finally, it got so hard to hold on to his pace that I couldn't even think the negative thoughts, and my mind just went completely quiet. And literally, in the moment that my mind went quiet, kind of off in the corner of my vision, I saw that picture of Don Jose, the old Huichol Indian shaman. And he was kind of, looked like he was floating off, you know, above the lava on my right side. Of course, my Western mind's going, what's that? You know, and I look over and all I see is lava. So then I kind of just zoned out again and looked straight ahead, and there he was. I could just see him right up here. And I could just feel that I was gaining this energy or this life force from him. And I really had that feeling like, you know what? I'm happy to be alive too. I'm happy to be next to Dave Scott. I'm still with the best guy in the world. There's nobody else here. I'm still giving him a run for his money. And I just got stronger and stronger and stronger. And a couple miles later, I knew that it was just a matter of time to just wait till the right moment. And as we passed through that aid station, Dave Scott turned to get that one last glass of water. And as he turned, something just said, go. And I just was like I was shot out of a cannon.
And my response was, well, you know, wait a second, I'm going to do that to you. We're getting to this top of the hill. Immediately I reacted and I said, I got to go. I've got to go with him.
Sorry, I don't know what's happening. It's showing, yeah. So I apologize we can't see this, because what's happening now is Mark Allen is drawing away from Dave Scott.
His stride seemed to gain about
This
6
is Dave
inches.
Scott speaking.
Every time we'd step, I'd fall a little bit farther behind. Right as I was cresting the top of the hill, I remember saying to myself, he's got too big of a lead. You know, that discomfort level, you're just hovering on that point where mentally you're saying to you, I don't know if I can do it, I don't know if I can do it.
When I got to the bottom of the hill, then I really looked back to see exactly where he was. I couldn't see him, and I just stopped in the middle of the road and I go, yes! Because I knew at that point that there was nothing that was going to happen in the closing meters of the race.
So I just want you to watch. This is a guy's race for 8 hours and 10 minutes.
Mark's seemingly
And tell me if he's
last few
fatigued or
miles
not.
have broken the Dave Scott magic.
Does this guy look fatigued?
And thousands lining Ali Eat Drive
So
were acknowledging
that
the
tells
result
you
of this
again that
amazing duel between both men.
Fatigue is not what
But
we think
Mark
it is. So let's go through what Dave Scott said. As he looked over, he knew that I knew this was the moment he was going to try to break me. I was still trying to answer, and I said, it's not going to happen. And once you say that, that's the end of the ball game. It's not going to happen. And I fought forward right as I was cresting the top of the hill. I remember saying to myself, he's got too big of a lead. And how does he know that? Because Mark Allen could drop dead the next second. We know that the discomfort level is just hovering on the point where mentally you're saying to yourself, I don't know if I can do it, I don't know if I can do it. And once you say that, then it's over. So I'm going to finish up with understanding the why, and then I'm going to just show you how it all ended up. So it's crucial in life you understand the why. And this is what Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. So as long as you understand why you do something, you'll do all the training you need to achieve the how. I know that you're not funded by Nike, and I apologize for that, but and this is not Greg, it's Phil Knight. And so I was running at the time that I'd started running when Nike came along, and that's really interesting to remember in my lifetime. You have to remember that Nike, once upon a time there was no Nike. And Phil Knight's view was that his goal was to be the dominant running shoe company in the US, even before he'd sold a single running shoe. And people like Kim and Greg, they have that vision, which we don't have, and they understand the future. But what I'm really showing you this for is because of his two first employees. This guy, Jeff Hollister, was his first employee who sold Nikes out of the back of his car. So they didn't even have a place to sell them. He would travel around the country to all the universities selling the shoes. And that's Steve Prefontaine, who was just one fabulous athlete in the 1970s. Now, Jeff Hollister has developed colon cancer, and I don't know what's happened, but he wrote a biography because he realized that maybe time's short. So he said, I've thought often of what it all means. Life thrusts you in a competitive environment. How do you prepare for the realities and the unknown? Hopefully you have a mentor. His mentor was a coach named Bill Bauman at the University of Oregon, who pushes you at that critical time, a time when someone has a belief in your future more than you do. And the whole theme of the talk has been how the coach must have more belief in you than you have in yourself. It's not about how long you live, but how you contribute. It's about doing your best and doing the right thing. It's about recovering from your mistakes and not giving up. It's about the baton pass to a new generation. It's about the realization that you cannot go it alone. It takes a team. So there's some wonderful messages there. And then he finishes up. In the end, you're somewhere in the middle, part of a never-ending process. That's where we forget that. We're just part of the game. We're not the beginning, we're not the end, we're just the middle. The future will never remember what was in your bank account or what kind of car you drove. The future will remember that wild ride of life where you believed in others and left a gift behind for someone else to dream the impossible. The gift was your own life. It does not matter whether it was long or short. What did you leave behind? And that's the question we all have to answer on our deathbeds. What did you leave behind? And it's a really important point to keep thinking about that. So now let's get back to the final of this game. So here we go, and this is the moment. So now, just a few minutes before this, so this is now, we've got 6 minutes left, and we're down by 18 points. And there's the try line for the opposition. So we managed to get the ball back to their try line. But what had happened just before this was that the opposition had scored twice in a very short time. They'd knocked our captain out, and another player had got a neck injury and was being stretchered off. So the coach said, well, we've got 5 minutes. We're not going to win this game. We'll put in the reserves. So he put the whole bunch, the 7 reserves on. And during the time that the guy who was having his neck treated, this guy number 10, who'd had a shocking game and shouldn't actually have been on the field, but the coach kept him on for a couple of reasons, he suddenly called the team together because he had a vision. And this was the vision that he said. And this is what he said to them. Oaks, that means guys. That's South African. Guys, I can't tell you or explain to you why, but I know that we're going to win this game. Something has just told me that we're going to win, and it doesn't matter if you believe in God or not, but I promise you a miracle is going to happen. Now, boys, you have to believe, but believe with your whole heart that we're going to win here, and I promise you we will. A miracle is going to happen now, but you have to believe. So that was at the 74th minute. And he was so confident, he took a bet with the referee who was on the field. We only have one referee on the field. He said, we're going to win this game. I'll bet you a beer after the game. And the guy bet him, obviously. So this is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is defined as a false definition of the situation, because we couldn't win. It was impossible to win from that situation, evoking new behaviors which make the original conception come true. And so what happened next was that we, in fact, scored within a few minutes, a few seconds here. He kicked the ball over. So now we're within 2 scores. We now have to score 2 more tries. And then this is the last 2 minutes or so when it's now already over 81 minutes and we're now 2 points down. And we have to take the ball from our own quarter to their quarter. And you'll see in rugby, the goal in rugby is to get a mismatch. So you move the ball around to try to find a mismatch where the defense is weak, whether you've got a better player on a weaker player, much like American football. But we keep the ball alive. The ball doesn't stop when you're tackled with it and your knee goes to ground. So this is what happens. And what you see here is 2 minutes of play where we were absolutely perfect, where anything could have happened. And most teams that don't have belief, they make the error in that time. And there were 13 of the players touched the ball during this phase. Let me just see. Yeah, there we go. I'm sorry, I think I've gone back.
UCG's got possession.
So it's 81 minutes. It's in red. So now we're going to move the ball around for a couple of minutes.
Worth 2 points.
So I understand you don't understand the game, but you can probably get an idea. Now these guys are trying to, but the defense is well lined up here, so there's nothing's going to happen here. So then we move it to the other side. No, he comes back this way. And all these little passes, any of them could have been an error. And for some reason, they weren't this day. So now we're going to tack down this side. No, we're still coming this way.
Show and go. Good work from...
Now we've opened this side of the field so that we're going to tack down that side. And you can see we've got more players out here than they have, so we can open a weakness down the side there. So now they're going to get the ball back again.
This would be
and it's now 82 minutes. Now there's a little bit of space over here.
The show and go, the space opens up. There it goes now. Solomon's back inside. Oh, there it is. Let them know. The biggest comeback of 2014.
So there were a couple of moments in that. There were a couple of passes that were astonishing. And that player, if you watched him, he actually slows down about 10 meters from the scoreline. And we asked him why. And he said, I was crying because I knew that there was never going to be a moment like this in my life again. And the interesting thing is that he'd had open heart surgery the year before, and in the whole season he played 4 minutes. And he kept telling the coach, he said, Coach, I'm going to score the winning try, which he did. So finally, one of your great presidents said this, men are not prisoners of fate, but only prisoners of their own minds. And what I hope to show you is that your mind really determines the outcome of your performances. And I've tried to show you the importance of team and all these other components that make for successful teams. And I hope I've given you an idea of what makes not just successful teams, but what makes superior people. It's people who follow all those pointers that I spoke about. So thank you very much for your attention.